Hey, so Moose, not too long ago, you and I were in the archives. We came across some work that John Boyd was doing on the strategic game of interaction and isolation. And one of the things we came across was this thing from Strong Vincent High School back in 1992. And it's actually John Boyd going back to be the keynote speaker, right? Speaker at his at a graduation there in Erie, Pennsylvania. Do you remember this at all, Moose?
I do, yeah. I'm very familiar with both the town of Erie, Strong Vincent High School, where I visited, and then also that particular speech. Yes.
Yeah, that speech is awesome. We can talk about this here in a moment. And today's episode, we really want to dive back into John Boyd's early life back in Erie, Pennsylvania. And to help us through that is Mark Squeglia, who recently was featured in a PBS episode named Chronicles. And the episode was John Boyd and his OODA Loop. So I reached out to Mark to be a guest today on the show to walk us through some of the reasons why they came up, why did PBS come to him and ask for help in creating this 30-minute Chronicles episode. So welcome to the show, Mark. How you doing this morning? Well, we're thrilled that you're here. So Mark, Moose and I watched the episode independently. I thought it was fantastic. But can we go back to how this episode, John Boyd and his OODA Loop on Chronicles on PBS, how it came to fruition?
So the local PBS station, WQLN, which serves northwestern Pennsylvania, at some point decided that they were going to create a series called Chronicles. And they had identified in the first season probably about 12 episodes. And now they're into their second season with another 12 episodes. And they defined the episodes as having to deal with Erie, Northwest Pennsylvania, and historical issues, historical events, or just the history of Erie. And at some point in time, during that episode development, they identified John Boyd as being a subject. I was at that point in time, I was the interim director of the Erie County Historical Society. I had been appointed to the board back in 2018, and in late 2020, 2021, the executive director decided to retire. The board president asked me to step in as an interim director of the Historical Society while they searched for a more permanent director. So I did that for about 8 months, and the WQLN team came down to the Historical Society because we have archives that is about 10,000 square feet, and we have quite a bit of information on the history of northwestern Pennsylvania and Erie. And they were doing research on the different Chronicle episodes. And at that point in time, I met the producer, and we had a discussion, and he asked me if I would be interested in narrating the Chronicles episode on John Boyd. So that's how that came to be.
And you're from the area, correct?
I'm from Erie, and I've been a lifelong resident, born, raised, educated, and unfortunately worked here my entire career, never wanted to leave, but I probably should have. But didn't want to leave family. So yeah, I've been here my entire life.
Well, thank you for that introduction to the episode. What I found fascinating about the episode, and I recently had a conversation with John Boyd's daughter, Mary Ellen, about John Boyd's upbringing. You talk about that in the episode, and just for our listeners out there, and Mark can back me up on this. John Boyd was born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1927. His father passed away at a young age, and I believe his sister had polio. So, and this is pre-war, post World War One, pre-World War II. So, growing up there, can you give us any more insights on Boyd's life, Moose or Mark?
Yeah. So you're right. John was born on January 23rd, 1927. His father passed away actually on his third birthday. John's father, Hubert, worked for Hammermill Paper Company. and I also worked for a Harriman paper company. He was a sales executive responsible for a certain territory. Harriman was a very unique company that it was a paper mill started by two German brothers who emigrated to Erie from Germany. And they started the company on the Lower East Side of Erie on the lake. And it became, over time, it became the preeminent company to work for in Erie. GE created or located a plant here in 1910, and they were in close proximity to each other. So General Electric and Harriman were the primary employers in this area. So John's father's position with Harriman was a good position. It was a leadership position in the company, and they were probably pretty well off, upper middle class. So when John's father passed away, John's mother definitely wanted to keep the family together, and they went from being somewhat affluent to becoming very poor very quickly. So John's mother was very strong-willed. She was very protective of her children. You're right. John's sister, his youngest sister, shortly after, or some period of time after his father passed away, contacted polio. And at that point in time, polio was viewed as being contagious. So the house was basically quarantined. And the family was more or less ostracized from the neighborhood because people didn't want to associate with them because they were afraid they were going their children may or may not catch polio.
And as time progresses on, I'm kind of curious, how did Boyd become interested in aviation? What influences were there?
So the majority of the information about Boyd's childhood is in Quorum's book that was written, I believe, in the early 2000s, which I think generated more Erie interest in Boyd than anything prior to that, because I don't think a lot of people, unless they went to Strong Vincent with him, knew about Boyd before that book was written. Because in actuality, after John graduated, he left Erie, he enlisted, he went to Japan, and then once he was discharged from the military, he came back and spent a short period of time here in Erie, and then ended up at the University of Iowa. So his time in Erie was brief, really. I mean, from graduating high school to entering the military. So I think the Quorum book really, that people that read it understood that there was an Erie connection with Boyd. And I'm sorry, I probably forgot the original question.
No, that's fine. Actually, I want to give some more context about Erie, Pennsylvania, and the reason for this is we'll have an upcoming episode with Mary Ellen Boyd where we look back at John Boyd's life again from her perspective. And she brought up something, and it's really to help me understand. I've never been to Erie, Pennsylvania. You both have. The connection to Native Americans in that area. What is there one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, the name Erie comes from the indigenous people, the Erie's Indians, that were located along the lakeshore, probably from, the Buffalo area through Erie to Cleveland. And they were eventually absorbed, eliminated by the Iroquois tribe. So that's where the indigenous influence comes from with the Erie's Indian. And then roughly around the mid 1700s, the French discover Presque Isle, which is the peninsula that forms Erie Bay, which I'm biased, but it is the finest, most pristine bay on the Great Lakes, and it's a natural harbor.
I would agree with that.
The French settle here. They build a fort, and then the fort becomes involved in the French and Indian War, and then the forts change hands. They go from the French to the British, and then eventually, the War of 1812, they go to or shortly after they go to the Revolution, they go to the Americas. So this area has been has a French, had a French influence, had a Native American Indian influence, British influence, and then finally, post-revolution, the U.S. influence.
We should point out that Presque Isle is a great place to go to swim and go to the beach. And that's actually where John Boyd worked as a lifeguard for many years.
Exactly. Yeah. So John, he grew up on Lincoln Avenue, which is about 2.5, 3 blocks from Harding School, where he went to grade school. But when he became a lifeguard, his house on Lincoln Avenue is a half a block from the bayfront. So when he was a lifeguard, he would either walk down the bluff and either row across the bay to get to the peninsula to lifeguard, or at times swim across the bay, which is about a mile and a half. So his time as a lifeguard, he developed a relationship with Frank Petnato, who was the lifeguard manager for many years, and he actually became a legend relation to Presque Isle and the beaches. And it was Petnato who became Boyd's father figure, more or less.
Yeah.
So, John was fatherless, and then he became a lifeguard, and Petnato took an interest in him and kind of, fathered him, gave him advice. And it was with Petnato's urging that Boyd, after he came back from Japan, went to Iowa to attend college,
Where he was a varsity swimmer on Iowa's team, I believe.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he was a very proficient swimmer and water polo player at Strong Vincent. When he was a senior at Vincent, the relay team that he participated on won the state championship, or the state title, and he finished second in the 220 freestyle as an individual during the state tournament.
To your point, when you go around Erie, I haven't been in Erie, say maybe in the last 4 years, but you can, in the quorum book, as you say, it has the address of the house on Lincoln Avenue and Strong Vincent High, and you can go see Presque Isle down at the lifeguard towers and things like that. But other than that, there's really nothing marking that John Boyd is from Erie. There's no PA historical plaque. There's no statue. I don't know if there's anything in the high school inside, because I didn't go inside. But what of Erie today is memorializing John Boyd?
To my knowledge, nothing right now. In fact, and if you have time for a little bit of a long story, how I became to know John Boyd was, I was giving a lecture, and I'm a World War II buff. That's all I've read about since I was a kid. So I was giving a lecture on, I think, the Battle of the Bulge at the Jefferson Educational Society, which is a local think tank that was created in about 2006 by an ex-college president and the ex-mayor of the city of Erie. So I was giving this lecture on the Battle of the Bulge, and just before the lecture starts, a gentleman comes out of the crowd and hands me Quorum's book on Boyd. And he says, "This is for you." And then he turns around and walks away. And I start the lecture because it was, the time to start. I finish the lecture, and I'm looking for this guy in the crowd, and he's already gone. So I take the book home. I'm eating my dinner, and I'm reading the book, and I read the first 3 pages. And I get to the part where Hubert, John's father, worked for Hammermill, and I'm like, holy cow, right? So, I zipped through the book in about 4 days. And I called this guy, and his name was Milt Pirtle. And I said, Milt, we talked for 40 minutes about Boyd, and I finally said to him, I said, all right, why'd you give me the book? He goes, well, I want you to do a lecture on Boyd. And I said, Milt, I can't do a lecture on one source. He goes, don't worry, I got 7 other books. I'll drop them at your house tomorrow. And bang, he gives me 7 books. So about a year later, I do the lecture on Boyd. And Milt was part of a group One of them, part of the group was a woman by the name of Sally Kohler, who was related to the family that started Kohler Brewing Company, which is an Erie legend. But she was a classmate of Boyd, and she lived next door to Boyd. And they were trying to, at that point in time, and this is back in 2010, 2011, trying to get the newly built Erie Convention Center named after Boyd. And they were not successful. The best that they were able to do is they were able to get a plaque put on 417 Lincoln Avenue, which is the house that he grew up. Fast forward to about 3 months ago, I was contacted by an ex-high school teacher who's a Navy veteran, and an ex-FBI agent who is located here. And they were talking to me about trying to get Harding School renamed for John Boyd. So in November, the Navy vet and I are going to go to the Erie School Board and present a request to rename Harding School for John Boyd. And I don't know if we'll be successful or not. So there's very minimal movement, right, to try to get John Boyd some recognition in Erie. Back in '04, and I was just going through a bunch of my material that I've acquired. Back in '04, that prior group was able to get the mayor to proclaim a certain day in 2004 as John Boyd Day. But I mean, that's merely a sheet of paper, and everyone's forgotten that anyway. So
I'm curious, has the Chronicles episode brought more attention to Erie, Pennsylvania, or even to John Boyd's connection to Erie, Pennsylvania in the last few months?
Well, yes,
Yeah.
right. A couple of other non-Erieites have contacted me or emailed me, and I've referred them to the producer of the ULN episode, Chronicles. So it has, but not to a really, really great degree.
It's the
Hopefully
sometimes
we can help change that.
Yeah, you hear John Boyd referred to often as the American Sun Tzu, and to think that he came from Erie.
Right.
Well, and Erie also has such a deep military history. Of course, that was the staging point for the Battle of Lake Erie, correct? And wasn't the
right. That's
the Niagara built there?
Perry built the fleet. Yeah, and we have Strong Vincent.
Strong Vincent
Hero of Little Round Top.
How about Gridley? Wasn't Gridley from Erie?
Gridley was from Erie.
Yeah.
The cannons, there's 2 cannons, I believe. I don't know if they're from the actual Olympia. I don't know if that was the ship in Manila Bay, but they're located in a cemetery out on the east side. Anthony Wayne, although he wasn't from Erie, his bones were buried here, and his bones were here, and then they were upturned, and the legend has it they were being brought back to Wayne, Pennsylvania, and fell off the wagon, and that's why Wayne's ghost shows up at a certain point in time. So we have minimal military heroes, but people don't know about Boyd, and people, you're right. I believe the work that he did, he could be referred to as a Sun Tzu for the
Was he bullied by any chance in Erie?
If you read Quorum's book, he was, the references, he was somewhat discriminated against because they were poor.
Yeah.
And the references, he had to go to school with holes in his pants or his jeans. I would probably infer that as being, he probably was, bullied as a kid. And there was a quote in Quorum's book that his mother's advice to him was never let anyone know your weaknesses. So I think that was a tremendous developmental mantra that affected his personality, right? Because his later personality and his dealings with senior leadership or his senior officers in the military was tremendously confrontational. I mean, it wasn't a smooth working relationship. So I think that, probably that Brian and his mother's advice, did affect his personality.
So we're starting to build an archetype for John Boyd now, where we have his father passing away when he's 3, his sister has polio. He grows up poor in Erie, Pennsylvania, maybe bullied a little bit, finds a father figure later on. And this is important, right, Mark? Moose, this is important to understand our orientation. So we're building an orientation for John Boyd now. Any thoughts, Moose?
Yeah, tremendous athlete. He turns to athletics, swimming, and lifeguarding. Lifeguarding is also a selfless act, right? I mean, that's guarding life, protecting. There's a lot of duty around lifeguarding. I've also thought it's never lost on me that the high school that he was named after someone that was really good at commander's intent. Giving his intent to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain at the Battle of the Little Round Top. Crystal clear, unambiguous. So, maybe there's some connection to Strong Vincent in that respect as sort of a a very clear example of things that Boyd would talk about regarding mission command and things like that.
Yeah, just a side note, Moose, I think the Chronicles episodes have 2 shows on Strong Vincent, actually. Is that correct, Mark? Yeah.
Yes, they do.
So again, something else we could dive into maybe later on. This is fantastic.
Well,
so the orientation of John Boyd.
Can I add? I was going to say, can we stay on that really quick, Mark? So
sure.
Boyd going to Strong Vincent High School and Strong Vincent being a very prominent sort of, I hate to say celebrity name, but historical figure name of someone that would have been well known. What could we have expected Boyd to know about Strong Vincent other than his high school was named after him? I mean, I wonder if there was any influence or impact on his story or his legend as he was a kid growing up. Would that be typical for kids growing up in Erie in those days?
I would guess yes, probably a Strong Vincent. Strong Vincent. I mean, at that time, Erie had a number of high schools, but they were neighborhood based, right? So it wasn't like John could decide to go to Academy or East over on the east side where he was located. He had to go to Strong. So it wasn't a selection process, but I would guess, and I can only refer to my uncle, who was younger than Boyd, but he played football for Strong Vincent in the 40s, the late 40s. And I asked him one time, I said, how did you become so attached to Strong Vincent, the man? And he said, we were on a football trip. We stopped in Gettysburg. He said, we went to Little Round Top and we see the statue, the rock, basically, where Strong Vincent was killed or mortally wounded. And he said, from that point on, I became interested in Strong Vincent. So I got to think at Strong Vincent High, there was, I don't want to say one course or one curriculum, but there had to be significant reference to Strong Vincent to the pupil.
Moose, have you made this connection before? Have you heard of this?
I have.
I mean, just never thought that John Boyd could have been influenced by Little Round Top, right?
So I took a group of leaders with our friend Don Vandergriff, who's been a guest on this show, who's the world's authority on mission command. And we were talking about Strong Vincent and his commander's intent to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, to the 20th Man at the Little Round Top. And now this particular group of executives that have been advising, we've discussed Boyd and Boyd's ideas, and so they're very well aware of Boyd. But I had to throw in, as we were explaining the sequence of the battle, I had to throw in, and guess who graduated from Strong Vincent High School? John Boyd. It just was a perfect connection, full circle. So it's never been lost on me.
You can also infer, you look at not Strong Vincent placing Chamberlain at the left end of the line, but Strong Vincent intercepting the orderly who's going to Vincent's regimental commander to give that person the orders to move people onto Little Round Top. And Vincent stops the orderly and says, "What are your orders?" And the orderly says, "I need to deliver these to the general." And Strong Vincent says, "Give them to me. I will take responsibility." I mean, there's a synonymous trait there between Vincent and John Boyd. I mean,
No question.
he's working on the energy maneuverability theory, right? Or he's codifying fighter tactics at Nellis. And his boss, his superior, says, "Don't waste your time. Don't bother doing it." And he continues to do it. And then he presents it to his superior officer, and the superior officer doesn't even want to read it. Eventually, he reads it and he totally accepts it. And then he takes it one step further when he goes to is it Eglin in Florida?
Eglin, yeah.
Airport. And he gets with Christie and he steals computer time to create the model to put in the, not only U.S. fighter performance metrics, but enemy fighter performance metrics to create, basically the energy maneuverability theory. So there's a lot of similarities between those actions on Strong Vincent's part and Boyd's part.
Hey, Moose, I'm wondering, I don't know if you have the copy of the speech he gave there in 1992. I have one ready, but it might be a good time to walk through that because it really codifies a lot of the lessons we're talking about now and some that we can bring together. Do you have a copy handy? Or
I'd have to digitally up. Yeah, I can get up.
Okay, I can put it on our screen. I can try it there. Let me add it to our screen. So this is actually, I'm not going to be able to do it. Here you go. Okay, I'm going to try to share it. Here we go. It's on our screen right there. I'll read this out loud, and I'll let you guys read it too. Mr. Grode, colleagues, students, and distinguished visitors, thank you for inviting me to a graduation that I missed some 47 years ago in June 1945. So this is 1992, I believe. Is that correct? We're looking at, 1992. Let me explain. He goes on to say, during those intervening years, I had the opportunity to interact with many different people and cope with many different kinds of situations. And some more context, Moose, this is before he sketched the OODA Loop. He's back at Strong Vincent talking to a graduating class. And this is where we are. Any comments on this to this point there, Moose?
Yeah, this is about the time where the famous the one that you can find on YouTube of him giving that conceptual spiral to Space Cast. This is about the same time. So this is at the pinnacle of his academic, his explorations.
Yeah. So he goes on to say, "What have I found? Learning does not end with a diploma or a graduation exercise." And this is him giving a speech at Strong Vincent.
To kids.
Our reality unfolds in a variety of, to kids. That's right. Our reality unfolds in a variety of ways that are essentially uncertain, ever-changing, and unpredictable. To thrive and grow in such a world, we must learn to adapt until the day we die. So here we go. We're talking about adaptation, learning. He's back at school telling everybody, you got to learn, right? Now, I'm going to let you take over here, Moose. This is the part we talked about briefly not too long ago. But you want to walk us through the next few lines there?
Why do I say this? Where did you drop off? I missed that.
Listening to a bunch of analysts, analyst piece.
So this is one of my favorite Boyd things, and he uses. And this is why I thought of that conceptual spiral video, because he says this exactly. Analysts surface and examine the features that make up a whole, and as I shall point out, such a person is really a half-wit. What about being an expert? Not good. An expert has all the answers. He's worked his domain or realm so often and so completely. He's a closed system, unable to comprehend and cope with new ideas and actions that lie beyond his turf for expertise. So
let's pause there for a second. Yeah. This is great. So he's talking about a closed system. This is early complex adaptive systems theories coming out about the late 80s, early 90s. And like Moose, I was able to go to Gettysburg, to Little Round Top, but with a complexity expert, Dave Snowden, where we walked through the same scenario. We went down to Quantico a few weeks later to talk about the connection between Boyd's OODA Loop and complex adaptive systems. And here he is talking plainly to graduating high school students about closed system thinking. So Moose, continue.
May I say one thing? If you're out there listening and you graduated from Strong Vincent High School in 1992, so you're roughly, Brian and my age, we want to hear from you, and we want to know that if you remember John Boyd coming to give you your address, graduation address, because we would love to see if it had any impression on you. Okay, worst of all is an analytical expert, a half-wit who thinks he has it all figured out but doesn't know what to do. We see these people being paraded in the media on nightly news programs, seminars, etc. They give us nice rhetorical descriptions and explanations of what has happened, but are unable to come forward with any comprehensive or creative proposals as to what should we be doing.
Wow, and that the impact that has in today's medium, today's technology, you can use the same speech and it would have a slightly different meaning today with our social media. But one of the things Moose and I talk about quite frequently is, there's some misinformation out there, and there are people that are unable to make. And I'm going to kind of project here in a little bit. Snowmobiles. So any thoughts from Mark or Moose on actually, Mark? Have you heard this before? You've ever seen this? Yeah. Yeah, so this is I'm glad we're bringing this up now because it connects back to Erie. Moose, you want to continue?
Yeah. So then what he's going to do is he walks them through the experiment. Imagine that you're on a ski slope with other skiers. Retain this image. Imagine that you're in Florida riding in an outboard motorboat, maybe even towing a water skier. Retain that image. Imagine that you're riding on a bicycle on a nice spring day. Retain this image. Imagine that you're a parent taking your son to a department store, and you notice he is fascinated by tractors or tanks with rubber caterpillar treads. Retain this image. Now imagine that you pull the skis off the slope. You pull skis off the ski slopes. You discard and forget the rest of the image. You pull outboard motor out of motorboat and discard and forget the rest of the image. You pull handlebars off bicycle, discard and forget the rest of image. Pull rubber treads off the toy tractors or tanks, discard, forget the rest of the image. This leaves us with skis, outboard motor, handlebars, rubber treads. Pulling this all together, what do we have? A snowmobile. As you can see, highlighting a feature from each domain is related to analysis, while connecting up each of these features is synthesis. The point, building or creating a snowmobile is an analytic synthetic effort, not just a reduction performed by some analytical expert. Again, if you were in the crowd and you heard that in 1992, we would love to hear from you. And we would love to know, is there somebody out there that heard what he said and took it for how he means, exactly how Ponch and I coach leaders and teams to do exactly that, so that they could become the best versions of themselves, become more competitive, collaborative, cooperative, etc., more creative. And there's Boyd telling a group of high school kids, and hopefully somebody listened. I'd love to know.
Yeah. He kind of ends up there at the metaphorical message about stagnation and decay set in when someone or individual group cannot build snowmobiles. Vitality and growth is possible when someone, a group or individual can build those snowmobiles. And he goes on to say, a loser is someone who cannot build a snowmobile when facing uncertainty and unpredictable change. And a winner is somebody who can. So here again, this is just, I think we'll get this to Mark. I can't remember how we pulled this out of his notes there, Moose, but we were able to spend some time on it. We initially thought we'd get AI to read this out. I think we'll leave that alone for now. But Mark, I just wanted to share that with you because I think this is important in what's happening in Erie, Pennsylvania. I'm going to stop share there. There's so many angles we can look at from this, that message he presented to the graduating class of 1992, things that we're talking about now as far as things like adjacent possibles, the synthesis of new technology. There's a lot of connections. I think, Moose, you may agree to Marshall McLuhan's work in that speech. But so much to go from that one little speech he gave addressing a graduating class in 1992 at Strong Vincent High School.
It is alma mater in his
cool,
hometown.
Yeah. And that's, again, before he sketched the OODA Loop, about 3 or 4 years prior.
Yeah. That's a critical component, because we can go through the archives and we can see his initial renderings of what ultimately became OODA Loop Sketch are happening around this time. But the version that we're all familiar with, when you Google it and you look at the Wikipedia page, that didn't come out until 1996, so 4 more years. But
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Moose, again, I can't remember how you and I pulled that together from his note. I think it was from notes, wasn't it? His notes.
It was in the folder. Yeah, it was in just so many folders down there that you're going through, and there's so much. This at Quantico, yeah, we'd love to take you down there sometime. I mean, it's the Boyd archives. First of all, the archives at Marine Corps University are phenomenal. And we mentioned Robert Coram, the author. You know, he not only wrote a book about John Boyd, he also wrote about a book about Victor Krulak. There's the Krulak Center there at Marine Corps University for Innovation. And, his archives are as equally fascinating. In a lot of respects, I think that there's a lot of connections and synergy with both Generals Krulak. There's Victor Krulak and Charles Krulak. Charles, who actually collaborated with Boyd and knew him personally and eulogized him when he passed. But that idea of constantly innovating and reinventing yourself, that's what Victor Krulak was doing with the Marines the entire time. It's because of Victor Krulak that we have Higgins boats, or we had Higgins boats at D-Day. It's because of Victor Krulak that Heliborne assault came to pass. So it was really interesting that Coram did both of their bios, because there's a lot of parallel stories. And Krulak was one of those guys that had knocked down a lot of those doors. But anyway, his archives are down there as well. But the Boyd archives, as Ponch could tell you, I mean, you can sit in there for the entire workday, and it was as if you've been in there for 30 minutes, because you can't stop. And it's so complete. You could decide to go through, say, his books. Like, so today we're going to focus on his books, and you can read all the marginalia and like on war. I took pictures of his entire marginalia in his Clausewitz copy. But then at the same time, you find napkins that have notes on them explaining the definition of a dynamic agent. Paper towels. He's taking notes on paper towels. On the back of, like, you could see it was lists that his wife had made, like shopping lists. But on the back of it, he was doing equations, things like that. So all this is there. They haven't had one in a while. Yeah,
well, we could set a time in the future and say, well, what's a good? Is it 2025 or 2026 when you want to do this? It's a little late right now.
Yeah, we could talk offline about some ideas too. It would be, there's always an interest in Boyd, but there's also still a lot of Boyd enemies. There are a lot of people that will suppress, deflect, oversimplify the OODA Loop. They'll do anything they can to dismiss Boyd, that he didn't go to college, or he didn't have a PhD, or he wasn't a general, or he wasn't a fighter ace, or whatever. There's all the typical things that you hear against Boyd, and really it's all ad hominem. It has nothing. They because they can't attack the concepts. The concepts are so sound. So.
Mark, let's pick back up on the PBS episode. So we've talked about John Boyd's pre high school career, and then a little bit going to, we know he goes off to Japan to serve over there. He comes back, goes to Iowa. Any idea why Iowa was selected, Moose or Mark?
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, so getting that MRS degree is important.
And then, and then
So yeah, he attended Iowa. He swam at Iowa. Um, I don't think he was as successful swimming at Iowa as he thought he would be, or as he was in high school. Um, but he ended up graduating with a degree in economics, and
Mhm.
then shortly thereafter shipped out. Or excuse me, no, he joins the ROTC at Iowa to make a few extra bucks. Um, and then the Korean War breaks out, and he ends up ending up in Korea shortly after the outbreak of hostility there.
and I can't remember the story, but I remember he thought something. I forget what his influence was in the book about why he wanted to be interested in being a fighter pilot versus a bomber pilot. I forget the.
Yeah, his interest in aviation goes back to when he was a child. There's reference to when he would be playing with you know, with the kids in the neighborhood, he would disappear, and then they would find him reading a magazine, and the reference was Popular Mechanics,
Mm.
and he ended up building model planes. And I don't know if he, bought the models and put them together, or he was carving, model planes out of balsa wood. Um, and then there was a family friend. The name was Eckert, and they started the Eckert drugstore chain here in Erie, which ended up becoming populated quite a bit of the eastern seaboard. And the family owned a plane, and Jack Eckert offered John Boyd a ride in the plane,
Mm.
which he jumps at the chance, and he takes the plane ride. And from that point forward, the references, he's totally hooked on aviation. And if he was that hooked on aviation, and there's no way he was going to want to fly a bomber. I mean, he would want singular control of the aircraft. And, and I know, Punt, you were a fighter jock. So, I mean, you guys are a different breed. You you're pushing the envelope to the limit all the time. And that's how he became so proficient of a flyer, is
Yeah.
that he pushed every aircraft that he was in to the absolute limit. And in some cases in his training, he took those training aircraft and did things with them that had never been done before when it comes to flying.
Mark, I'm curious. You've been looking at history for a while, and when you look at John Boyd's background, and I think you read Form's book first. Is it surprising to you that somebody who came out of Erie, Pennsylvania, ends up creating EM theory, does some work with tactical aviation before that, and then goes on to do what he did in the Pentagon? I just want to hear your thoughts, because you've been doing a lot of research on folks from World War II and
Yeah.
up to today. Is this an exceptional human being, a philomath? What's going on in your mind?
I think this individual had a mind that was just unbelievable. And I don't think he was born with it. I mean, I think his mind developed over time through the different experiences that he went through. His military experience totally honed his mind. And then the physical experience about flying an aircraft. I mean, I don't think he jumped into the cockpit on the first day and said, I'm going to write the energy maneuverability theory. I think it was the experience of flying the plane that he realized that there's a better way, or even, codifying the fighter tactics. His experience in Korea as a wingman, he wasn't even the shooter, but he was the wingman. But he had to think and say, there's got to be a better way than this. So I just think his mind was unbelievable. It was part engineering mind, part philosophical mind, part totally application mind, right? I mean, what's the OODA Loop? It's all of those things put together, right? And, that was kind of, the ultimate end of his thought process was, the OODA Loop. So I just think, tremendous mind. I'm trying to think of someone similar, a prominent leader during World War II that may have had that kind of mind. I know he doesn't even reach intellectually to that point, but tactically, my favorite is George Patton. And, I look at his management of the Third Army in Europe, his prior career in the military, his development of the tank weapon, in World War I and then post World War I, prior to World War II. Patton had even though he was looked at as being profane and abusive at some points in time, I think Patton had a tremendous mind in terms of developing.
And Quorum mentions Patton. I was going to say, when Quorum talks about Boyd and maneuver warfare, he specifically mentions Patton. That Patton had, I think the quote that he uses in the book, the language that he uses, he had the spear directly on the heart of the Germans, and Eisenhower slowed them down and stopped them because they didn't understand what was happening.
Yeah, I've made 2 trips to Normandy, and the most recent one was for the 80th this year in June. And I mean, you play and I'm not a revisionist history person, but you play what if games and say, what if it was Patton in command rather than Montgomery on D-Day? And subsequently the Battle of Normandy, right? I mean, you don't know, because the Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied commander.
Yeah.
And they wanted to know where he was at certain points in time, which is why Eisenhower put him in charge of the fake army over in eastern England, to make the Germans think that we're gonna invade over the Pas-de-Calais, which is the shortest route over the Channel, rather than the 65 or 80 kilometers over the Channel from like Plymouth to Caen or Cherbourg. So there's a lot. I think there's a lot of similarities in thought process between Patton and Boyd.
Yeah, Quorum.
But that's me personally, because Patton's one of my favorites. So, or it
Well,
is my favorite. So.
Well, I think Quorum would agree with you. Like I said in the book, that the style of warfare that Patton was inflicting upon the Germans, to your point, they were deathly afraid of him. So there was a psychological, moral aspect of it too, not just the physical. And when they slowed Patton down, it dragged the war out. And Quorum says it dragged the war out another 6 months and cost another 1 million lives.
Right. And Patton also read Guderian's book and Rommel's book prior to the war. So Patton was in the German mind. I mean,
doing what Boyd said, get in there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, really appreciate you being here today. The Chronicles episode is John Boyd and his OODA Loop. It's a local PBS station out of Erie, Pennsylvania. We highly recommend that all our listeners go and watch that. It's a great 30-minute episode on some of the things we talked about today and more. But I want to turn it over to you, Mark. If you have any questions to us or comments, anything you want, you're curious about, this is your time to ask away. And we reserve the right to make up our own stories here. Okay.
Okay. Well, yeah, I do have a question. I'm obviously very interested in John Boyd, and working towards trying to get John Boyd some recognition here in Erie, but also educate people, in Erie about Boyd and elsewhere. And that's the result of the PBS Chronicles series. But my question to both of you is how do you integrate? I've read a little bit on your website. How do you teach Boyd principles to businesses? I think our initial conversation, Brian, was you talked about Agile, and I said, well, I'm Agile educated, but when it comes to project management, I totally hated putting together a project plan, because on day 2, I pretty much threw the project plan out the window
Right.
and managed the project by the seat of my pants, and
Yeah.
really hated doing status reports and reporting upwards on the status of the project. So I'm really curious to know how you integrate the OODA Loop and Boyd's teachings. And
Yeah,
when you
that's
go
a
to
huge.
counsel and coach businesses, how do you do that? What do you
That's
do?
that's a massive question. So I'll just touch on the agile connection there. The big connection is agility is an outcome of the OODA Loop. So if you look at who signed the Agile Manifesto, who created it, one of the persons is Jeff Sutherland, a former RF4C pilot who later on got a PhD at Colorado, and I think in biology. So connecting aviation to biology. He also examines the Toyota production system, sees something by the new product development game, and he names this thing called Scrum. He basically says, "Hey, this approach of plan, execute, assess, or your planning, your sprint planning, your daily stand-ups, your container, your review with your customers, and your retrospective. That is a team life cycle that all aviators do. You plan, execute, assess. The outcome of that is learning, adaptability, and agility. Resilience, safety, and innovation are also outcomes of that. So that is already baked into I'll say it, the Agile Manifesto. The key signatory of the Agile Manifesto, he's been on the show. He even says Agile is an outcome, or agility is an outcome of OODA loops, observe, orient, decide, act. I think where we kind of stray from that thinking is they're thinking of the OODA loop looks like the PDCA cycle. That's not what we're talking about here, but we do agree with them that agility is an outcome of a high quality observe, orient, decide, act loop. So how do we teach this? Okay. There are many ways to teach this. The current method that we use is to take them through human factors training. Where we do not even show them the OODA loop. We don't talk OODA loop. We don't do any didactic type of training. We let them experience how humans perceive reality. And a lot of this information is coming out from folks like Anil Seth, and Andy Clark, other researchers from neuroscience, the free energy principle, active inference, which all connect back to what John Boyd was studying through the second law of thermodynamics, through I'm trying to
Uncertainty.
think, cybernetics. Yeah, so complexity, systems thinking, all that. There's a nice connection to these new theories, if you will, of how the brain perceives reality. So we take them through that, and you can't argue with that experience. They experientially learn how they perceive a rainbow, how they see a coffee cup, and by the way, what ends up happening is that flow diagram ends up being the OODA loop. It's pretty powerful, right? It's really, really powerful to see that. So we don't observe, orient, decide, and act. You actually predict what's coming out of my mouth next before it actually comes out, right? And that way it reduces the energy spent in your brain, and all that we take them through. Now, we don't spend a lot of time on that. We then show them that, hey, now that you know how you all perceive reality, and reality is really constructed top down, inside out, it's a controlled hallucination. We're not passively experiencing the external world. We actively do it. Now we can take them through things like red teaming. Why do we need multiple perspectives to understand our past? So now we're starting to look back at why do we need a effective, good planning process as a team to plan forward. And planning is not about executing a plan, but the ability to adapt to change as we learn more from the external environment. So going back to your point about a Gantt chart in project management, yeah, once you build a plan, it's dead the moment it touches reality, right? So that's not how fighter aviation works. It's you have a plan to deviate from, right? That's it. It's here's a basic plan, and oh my gosh, that's not what's going on, but we know what to do because we can replan as we go. So this is a loaded question. When it comes to teaching flow, if you look at the OODA loop as a flow system, the number one currency, the most important currency there is new information, right? We have to allow new information to flow in that OODA loop. And if you think about what's going on in the world today with social media, cancel culture, all that, that's the war on information warfare, right? It's external. Now, cognitive warfare is internal. Like, how do I change the orientation of somebody through medicines or pharmaceuticals or putting poison in food, whatever it may be. That is happening today as well. So you have a cognitive warfare going on and information warfare going on, which is attacking your OODA loop, that information flow within there. Now, the key to this is you have to update. You're asking, how do we coach organizations? If you're going to build a strategy, and I'm going to turn this over to Mark here in a second, you have to build a map of the external environment. That's the key point, right? Orientation is about building that internal map of the external environment. If you do not have one, you do not have a strategy. You cannot have a strategy. A strategy is not a SWOT analysis. A strategy is not a bunch of sticky notes on the wall. A strategy starts with a map. And there are folks that picked up on this, and they actually have mapping techniques to understand the external environment so we can operate in it. So there's a lot more. Mark's doing some other things as well. We use this inside of the markets, finance, sports. I mean, you can ask the same question: how do you apply this to teaching your kid basketball? How do you apply it to teach them, the importance of going to school? It's the same. It's humans are inherently predictive machines. They're trying to update their OODA loop, and we're not trying to go faster through it. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark here in a second. Speed is not everything in the OODA loop. So, Mark, you want to build on some of these ideas?
Yeah, the biggest thing that I try to hammer home is that the orientation is the critical component, and everyone's orientation is unique to them, and orientation is fractal. So I can have one myself, but I can have one as a group, a squadron, a company, a state. It doesn't matter. We can, orientation is fractal up and down. What Boyd's OODA Loop sketches is an abstraction, like Punch said, a map of how that orientation functions and how it shapes how we make sense in the world, how we make decisions, and how we test those decisions via actions, and how we learn. Our biggest mission, Mark, is always talking about how the reduction of Boyd is setting people behind. They're just going to be chasing their tail forever. The simplified OODA loop in a circle is actually a dog chasing its tail. It's the same thing. When you look at the abstraction of that he illustrated before he passed, then you start to realize that my cognition and my ability to analyze and synthesize, my ability to accept new information, my cultural heritage, my genetic heritage, my traditions and things like that, all of that shapes and has a direct impact on how I look at the world, how I look at reality. And we'll all come up with different things because our orientations are all unique. If we're all in the same team or the same organization or part of the same culture, likely we'll see those facts the same way. But what Boyd was trying to do was give people an understanding of how they can thrive in ambiguity, where anything can be interpreted in any direction. Back to your example about Patton. Patton saw something completely different than Eisenhower and Montgomery and Bradley. And the Germans were doing it. Patton was creating mismatches for the Germans to the point where they were rendered, this thing is over. They thought it was over. And then when Patton stopped, they were stunned because they were getting ready to surrender. And they realized that Eisenhower had just stopped Patton. That's all understanding OODA loop and orientation and how it shapes, implicitly guides and controls how we see things make sense and how we act and learn. And that's really what Boyd is talking about. And I think one of the saddest things about John Boyd is that he passed away so young, because what he was pursuing, we're still trying to catch up. We're still trying to figure that out. And even his closest acolytes don't even agree on what he was pursuing. They just know it was something bigger than what he's reduced to. And that's why we think our work's important. And that's why we're grateful for the work that you're doing to create more awareness about John Boyd, because he was an amazing thinker.
Yeah, I'm going to add to this, Mark. Through this podcast, we've been able to talk to folks that two knuckle draggers would never be given the opportunity to talk to. It's people in the neuroscience space that are looking at things like active inference, artificial intelligence, and for us to be able to do that human factors to OODA Loop 40-minute course, that allows us to have conversations about the difference between large language models and what is kind of being touted as active inference artificial intelligence, this next level of artificial general intelligence, what that looks like. It also allows us to have conversations with folks in finance to talk about economic models and what's going on in the global economy today. We can talk about mental health. We can talk about the default mode of operation, ego, and how you have to suppress that to gain access to counterfactual thought, which can be described in John Boyd's OODA Loop as well. It's already in there, right? And specifically when you put a boundary around that. We could talk about things, and we brought this up earlier when we were looking at the address to the high school there, and that is adjacent possibles. If you understand the adjacent possibles, that means you can build snowmobiles. So people have already picked up on this type of thinking that John Boyd was already on the path of doing years ago, and they put formulas to it, right? So now when we can have that conversation and go, okay, if we want to spend time on adjacent possibles and building strategy maps through the free energy principle, we can do that using John Boyd's OODA Loop. Now, I just lost 90% of the people that are on this podcast going, I have no idea what you just said. And I'm like, exactly. That's why, coming into the podcast, listening to it, we'll slow things down with guests to kind of go, what do you mean by this? What is assembly theory? And does that connect to what John Boyd was giving us years ago? Rather than, hey, PDCA and OODA Loop are the same thing, go fast around them and you're excited, that's what you need to do. No, you don't. You do not need to go through an OODA Loop faster. And you got me excited about this because this is why we're here, going back and understanding John Boyd's orientation, the genetics, the cultural heritage, the previous experience before he left high school is important, right? What were his influences there? And today the big one is the connection that I wasn't not aware of between Little Round Top and which is Mission Command. I mean, that is a massive connection. And later on, he studies that through looking back through the Germans and Sun Tzu as well. So a lot of connections here.
Yeah. Yeah, he was okay with having nothing and reducing his needs to zero, and he was very humble about that. And it's interesting. We had a guest on yesterday talking about Vincent van Gogh, who was, died penniless, and he's giving all these paintings away that turned out to be, literally billions of dollars worth of art. But he, there's a lot of story about Boyd, I think, in that respect too, where it's those of us that are carrying on his mission and developing his work that are helping him bring the notoriety that he never got in his own lifetime. And the value of it, we say this all the time, when you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, you become unstoppable. And that's what people, when we're coaching them and teaching them, we're trying to get them to that point where they can see it inherently. Because that's the thing, everybody's doing it. Everybody's observing, orienting, deciding, and acting, whether they understand John Boyd or not. It's when they understand it and how it works in the context of complexity, then they can thrive and not merely just survive. So
I think that's a good place to wrap it up. And for those listeners out there that know anybody from the class of 1992, please contact us. We want to hear from you. And Mark, I'll turn it over to you to see if you have any last comments.
No, we definitely want to hear from them. Like I said, you're probably our age. I'm high school '94. I think Brian's '92, right? So we're age peers, and we'd love to hear from those Gen Xers that were influenced by John Boyd. And if anybody took it to heart, if anybody remembered it, we would really, really love to hear if that speech influenced you. And then Mark, from one Western Pennsylvania to another, thank you so much for taking the time and helping us cast more light on a very important part of our country. Granted, you and I are both biased, but there's a lot to learn here, and John Boyd is certainly a significant part of that.
To continue the association going forward. It doesn't have to be on a podcast. I'd love to meet with you guys and talk about, Boyd things and different, how it relates to business and some of the consulting that you're doing. So looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you.